On February 3, 1945, American bombers struck the People's Court in Berlin during a Saturday session. A falling beam killed Judge President Roland Freisler in his own courtroom. His body was found clutching the file of the man he was about to sentence to death, Fabian von Schlabrendorff, one of the July 20th plotters who had tried to kill Hitler. He survived. In 1967, he joined West Germany's highest court. 29 of Freisler's fellow judges were already there. His path to that bench began on a Russian airfield in 1943. On March 13, 1943, a German officer handed a small parcel to a lieutenant colonel boarding Hitler's aircraft at Smolensk airfield. Wrapped to resemble 2 bottles of Cointreau, a gift between officers, it contained a time bomb. The officer was Fabian von Schlabrendorff, adjutant to Oberst Henning von Tresckow at Army Group Center. He had set the detonator for 30 minutes after takeoff. It never fired. The cold of the unheated luggage compartment killed the chemical fuse before the explosives could detonate. Schlabrendorff flew to East Prussia the next day, recovered the parcel before anyone could open it, and disappeared back into his official duties. Born in Halle in 1907 to a Prussian aristocratic family, he had trained as a lawyer in the 1930s and joined the Wehrmacht as a reservist when the war began. In January 1941, he was posted to Army Group Center as Tresckow's adjutant, and over the next 2 years became the secret liaison between von Tresckow and the Eastern Front and the central conspirators in Berlin, Ludwig Beck, Karl Goerdeler, Hans Oster, and Friedrich Olbricht. He continued resistance work through 1943 and into 1944, carrying messages between the Eastern Front and Berlin and taking part in further coup planning. On July 20, 1944, Klaus von Stauffenberg detonated a bomb in Hitler's briefing room at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Hitler survived. The conspirators in Berlin had hours to seize power before the news reached the capital, and they failed. Most were arrested or shot within hours. Von Tresckow took his own life the next day rather than face capture. Schlabrendorff was implicated through his work with Tresckow and arrested in mid-August. He was held in the Gestapo prison on Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin and tortured for weeks. He gave them no names. In adjacent cells sat Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the former head of military intelligence, and Hans Oster, his deputy. Karl Goerdeler, the conspirators' candidate for chancellor, was in the same wing. Throughout the autumn of 1944, Roland Freisler had presided over the show trials of the senior plotters, sentencing them to death in proceedings filmed on the orders of Joseph Goebbels. Goerdeler was executed at Plötzensee on February 2, 1945. Von Schlabrendorff's turn before Freisler came the following morning. He was in the courtroom that Saturday when the American bombers struck. The raid was one of the heaviest American daylight attacks of the war on the city. A direct hit on the People's Court at Bellevue-Strasse brought down a section of the roof during the session. Roland Freisler died beneath a falling beam. Von Schlabrendorff, sitting only meters away, was unhurt. When his file was prized from Freisler's hand the following morning, the trial had simply been postponed. The court itself was still standing. So was the man who would replace its president. The trial reopened a month later under Wilhelm Kroner, Freisler's deputy, now acting president of the People's Court. Von Schlabrendorff conducted his own defense. His argument was procedural. The torture he had been subjected to had rendered the proceedings outrageously unworthy of justice. On March 16th, in one of the rarest verdicts of the People's Court ever issued, Kroner's court acquitted him. Acquittal did not mean freedom. Von Schlabrendorff was transferred from one concentration camp to another, Sachsenhausen, Flossenburg, then Dachau, and in late April moved to Tyrol with roughly 140 other prominent prisoners. SS guards escorting the column were intercepted by a regular Wehrmacht unit, and the SS commander in northern Italy ordered them to stand down. On May 5, 1945, the US Fifth Army liberated the group. Von Schlabrendorff had been a man the regime tried to execute. Now he was one of the regime's most useful witnesses. He wrote analyses of the Wehrmacht and Nazi war crimes for William Donovan's Office of Strategic Services, and Donovan questioned him personally. When Donovan joined the American delegation preparing the Nuremberg trials, he brought von Schlabrendorff with him. The man Freisler had nearly killed was now on the staff that would try the system Freisler had run. The 3 men who had run the Reich Justice Ministry in succession were already beyond reach. Franz Gürtner had died of natural causes in January 1941. Freisler was dead. Otto Thierack, who had succeeded Schlegelberger as Justice Minister in August 1942, was captured by British forces and took his own life at the Eselheide internment camp in October 1946. The American military tribunal that opened at Nuremberg on March 5, 1947, would have to settle for the men beneath them. 16 men stood in the dock. 9 former Justice Ministry officials, 7 judges and prosecutors from the People's Court and the Special Courts. The senior defendant was Franz Schlabrendorff, who had run the ministry after Görtner's death and held it as acting minister until 1942. Among them was Oswald Rothaug, the Nuremberg Special Court judge who had sentenced the elderly Jewish merchant Leo Katzenberger to death on charges of racial defilement. In its judgment, the tribunal described the case in a phrase that became its epitaph: "The dagger of the assassin had been concealed beneath the robe of the jurist." On December 4, 1947, the tribunal delivered sentences. 4 defendants received life imprisonment, including Schlabrendorff and Rothaug. 5 others received fixed terms of 7 to 10 years, 1 was given 5. 4 were acquitted. Von Schlabrendorff had been the man on trial. Now the men who had built the courts that tried him were on trial themselves. Within 10 years, every one of them would be free. Von Schlabrendorff returned to legal practice in West Germany. In 1946, he published Offizier gegen Hitler, later translated as The Secret War Against Hitler, edited by Gero von Gaivenitz, one of the first major German memoirs of the July 20th plot. He spent the late 1940s working as a lawyer, writing and lecturing on the resistance and giving evidence in trials of senior Nazi figures. The men who had nearly killed him were in Landsberg prison. That did not last. Franz Schlabrendorff walked out of Landsberg in 1950 on health grounds. He was 73 and had served less than 3 years of his life sentence. Returning to Flensburg, he fought for and eventually won a state secretary's pension from a Schleswig administrative court, published legal texts, and lived until December 1970. He died at 94, a free man drawing a state salary from the country whose justice ministry he had helped run for Hitler. Kurt Rothenberger, sentenced to 7 years, was released the same year and went back to legal work in Hamburg. When investigations into his past reopened in 1959, he took his own life. Oswald Rothaug, who had sentenced Katzenberger to death, served until December 1956. Herbert Klemm, Tirach's wartime state secretary, was released the following year. By the end of 1957, all 4 life sentences had been commuted. None of the men convicted in the justice case completed the prison term the tribunal had imposed. These outcomes were not accidents. On January 31, 1951, U.S. High Commissioner John J. McCloy issued a sweeping clemency decision covering the Landsberg prisoners. 10 of 15 death sentences were commuted. Most fixed terms were reduced. Throughout 1950, pressure had built. The Soviet atomic test, the outbreak of war in Korea, West Germany being courted as a Western ally. McCloy's clemency cleared the Americans. The bigger instrument was waiting in Bonn. On May 11, 1951, the Bundestag passed the implementation law for Article 131 of the Basic Law with only 2 abstentions. It returned nearly every former civil servant, judges and prosecutors included, categorized below major offender under denazification, to government service, with seniority and pensions intact. A 1948 OMG-US communique had already reported that 60 to 70% of judges and prosecutors in the US zone were former Nazi Party members. Article 131 protected them. By the late 1950s, the West German judiciary looked much as it had under the Reich. Von Schlabrendorff watched it happen from inside the profession he had nearly died defying. In 1967, West Germany gave him a seat on its highest court. On September 1, 1967, Fabian von Schlabrendorff was sworn into the Federal Constitutional Court's Second Senate at Karlsruhe. He was 60 years old. By then, he had been acquitted by a Nazi court, had written one of the first German memoirs of the resistance, and had watched the men who had built the Nazi court return to legal practice. His tenure on Germany's highest bench would last 8 years. That summer, a Berlin court convicted Hans-Joachim Reiser, a former People's Court judge who had signed 231 death sentences, of complicity in 3 murders. He was sentenced to 5 years. No West German court had ever convicted a People's Court judge before, none ever would again. On December 6, 1968, after a retrial ordered by the Federal Court of Justice, Reiser was acquitted. The appeals court reasoned that a judge could be convicted for his verdicts only if he had knowingly broken the law, a doctrine known as Richterprivileg, or judicial privilege. Reiser said he had believed his sentences were legal under the laws of the time. That was enough. All other investigations into People's Court personnel were dropped. On December 15, 1970, the Second Senate ruled on a constitutional challenge to a new law expanding state powers of surveillance and wiretapping. The majority upheld the law. Von Schlabrendorff disagreed. Alongside Justices Geller and Rupp, he became the first judge in the Federal Constitutional Court's history to put his disagreement on the record. A man whose hands had been driven through with spikes by the Gestapo in 1944 was writing the court's first formal objection to expand state surveillance. Von Schlabrendorff retired on November 7, 1975 after 8 years on the bench. The reckonings, when they came after him. In February 1978, the playwright Rolf Hochhuth published an article, Die Zeit, describing Hans Filbinger, Minister-President of Baden-Württemberg and federal vice-chairman of the CDU, as a terrible jurist for his work as a Kriegsmarine military judge in 1945. 4 death sentences in which Filbinger had participated came to light. He resigned on August 7, 1978, the most prominent West German politician forced from office over a Nazi-era judicial record. Von Schlabrendorff died on September 30, 1980 in Wiesbaden. He was 73. On January 25, 1985, the Bundestag passed a resolution declaring the People's Court an instrument of judicial murder and state terrorism. On May 28, 1998, a federal law annulled every judgment that court had ever handed down, including the 1945 charges against von Schlabrendorff himself. He had been dead 18 years. The court that had tried to kill him had been struck from the German legal record by the country whose highest bench he had sat on. Well, that's it. If you found this video insightful, watch Why Did So Many Nazis Escape to Syria After World War II next. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more history inside, and thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.